Hello and welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us at the latest research news. Over the past few decades, environmental NGOs, referred to as ENGOs, have come to play an increasingly important role and position in environmental politics. States no longer hold a monopoly over environmental regulations and policies, as not only ENGOs, but also corporations, social movements, and of course, intergovernmental organizations such as the UN now play a part. To discuss ENGOs and the global environmental discourse out there, today we are joined by Dr. Stefan Partelow. Dr. Stefan Partelow is an environmental social scientist at the Leibniz Centre for Tropical Marine Research in Bremen, Germany. Stefan, thank you very much for your time. You and your co-authors recently published a new study in which you analyzed an original dataset of nearly 680 ENGOs that participate at major UN global environmental conventions during the mid-2010s. And you analyzed their mission statements to determine the main global environmental discourses out there. Before we get into your analysis of the global environmental discourse, can you please first share a historical overview of ENGOs?
Yeah, first of all, thanks for having me on. It's a pleasure to talk about this work together. It goes a bit to your introduction about who governs the environment. And since the 1950s or so, civil society organizations have played a pretty large role in doing that. And that includes environmental NGOs, which have increasingly, specifically since the 1980s and early 1990s, have an increased role in the governance of the environment. So we're beginning to see over the last half century or so, a move towards more what we would call polycentric governance arrangements. So there's multiple centers of decision making made by different actors within society that's not just limited to state governments. And as I said, since the 1990s or the 1980s and 1990s, environmental NGOs have been a major player. And one of the big catalysts for the global environmental NGO movement was the United Nations Conference on Environment and Development in 1992, which is also known as the Rio Earth Summit. And during that convention, that conference, there was three particular UN framework conventions which were founded. One was the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and the other was the Convention to Combat Desertification, and the other was to combat or the Convention on Biological Diversity. And so within that frame, many NGOs have evolved to focus on those issues.
So what are different kinds of environmental NGOs out there these days? And for your research and your paper specifically, how did you decide what kind of organization constitutes as an ENGO?
Well, I think it might be intuitive to recognize that there are, of course, a diversity of different organizations out there, but it's also a common assertion within the environmental world that a lot of environmental NGOs focus on environmental management issues, such as conservation. Those might be the first issues which come to mind. And if I were to ask anyone to name a handful of different environmental NGOs which exist, most likely a handful of kind of household names would come to mind, many of these bigger NGOs which folks are familiar with. But of course, there are many hundreds, if not thousands, of organizations which exist, which focus on environmental issues. And where our study comes in is that there really hasn't been a comprehensive empirical overview of the sector, which looks at the diversity of focus areas, but also the structural capacity. So things like number of employees and financing capacity of the different organizations. We really haven't had a broad generalization of the sector yet. And a lot of the existing studies, while there is a very large literature looking at the sector, they're focused more on single case studies or small and comparative analyses or regional studies.
I see. And where are most ENGOs based in or from? And did you find any discrepancies between North and South ENGOs? Sorry.
Yeah, well, I'll touch a little bit on the sampling methodology from the first question. And there's always a debate within science about different sampling methodologies and what's the inclusion criteria for the NGOs that we wanted to focus on. And what we wanted to do is we wanted to let the organizations self-identify into our sample instead of us making our own classification system. And so what we did is we took ENGOs who are registered with the three UN conventions, which I mentioned before, which were grounded in the 1992 Rio Earth Summit. And we looked at which organizations classified themselves as environmental organizations as being participants in those three conventions. And this was in part or what we believe was in part limiting the sampling bias so that we didn't have to make our own judgment, and really the NGOs chose to be in our study based on how they classified themselves.
See, that makes a lot of sense. So really, all of the environmental organization that took part in these conventions, you considered them as being
Exactly.
NGO.
So they can take part in it. They can also just apply to be a part of the network of organizations who support that convention as well.
Okay, I see. And so then in the second part of your study, you, if I'm not mistaken, you looked at the mission statements of all these ENGOs that we just mentioned to determine what are really the main global environmental discourses out there. So what did you find?
Yeah, we looked at discourses, and we also looked at structural capacity. So I think I'll say a few words about that, about financial and human resource capacity. So since the 1950s, Europe and North America have historically had the highest number of total NGOs in the world. We looked at the year that they were founded. And also we see in that period, Asia had quite a few NGOs. But since 1990 and the 2000s, we see NGOs coming up in all different types of regions around the world. We basically see a global distribution. And while there are many NGOs everywhere, the distribution of financial resources is more or less highly skewed, you could say. I mean, about 6% of the ENGOs hold about 75% of the total budget, and the wealthiest 20% of the NGOs hold about 94% of the financial resources. So most of the highest budget-oriented NGOs are located in North America, and that's followed by Europe and Latin American and Caribbean countries, and the lowest are in Africa, and that's quite substantially lower. So this is a very much a descriptive overview and very general, but it helps give us an indication of where perhaps the highest political influence or the influence in practically of these organizations are around the world.
And so then in the second part of your study, you, if I'm not mistaken, you looked at the mission statements of all these ENGOs that we just mentioned to determine what are really the main global environmental discourses out there. So what did you find?
Well, the first thing we did was within mission statements, the data is the words themselves. So we looked at single words. What are the most common single words which occurred across all the mission statements? And generally, across all the environmental NGOs, we saw words like environmental, development, sustainable, people, climate, community, protect, these types of words. We also looked at meaningful word combinations, so combinations of 2 or 3 words, things like sustainable development, climate change, natural resources, civil society, renewable energy, human rights were common meaningful word combinations. And then in the second part of that analysis, we wanted to see, okay, but how do those terminologies which are used in the mission statements cluster together, right? So we want to see themes of words, what we might refer to as a discourse of words which did that. Which NGOs focus on, rather. And to that, it was somewhat of a novel methodological approach. We wanted to take an we developed an inductive quantitative analysis method to identify that clustering technique. And then we could see basically what groups of words, based on which NGOs use them, group together. And then we tried to make sense of this basically and try to identify what those words mean and attach a discursive meaning to that. And so what we did is we identified 4 clusters or 4 discourses. The first one was called environmental management. It was the most prevalent discourse. So words like management, conservation, nature, kind of the more typical, what you would think of as environmental NGOs focus on. But the second one was climate politics. So that words grouped together like international, climate change, government, and politics. Right. So there's clusters of words which kind of came together in the mission statements across NGOs there. The third was environmental justice. And so this is issues of rights and people and diversity and justice. And the fourth was ecological modernization. And so this related more to renewable energy, emissions reductions, businesses, policies. And we used this typology. You can see that along that spectrum, there are differentiations between the different NGOs.
So what does the prioritization of these 4 discourses reveal? What do they say?
Well, one important thing to say is that a lot of the NGOs cluster towards the center in our methodology. If you look at one of the figures in our paper, you'll see that while we can differentiate the 4 discourses, a lot of them, or most NGOs, you could say, actually have some words and terminologies which relate to all of these arenas. So we can say, yeah, there is a centralized focus around certain issues, but we can see that there are NGOs who do focus on more specific terminologies, and they focus more on climate politics, or they focus more on justice issues related to people, or they focus more on business and policy and emissions and technologies, if you're looking at things like ecological modernization terminologies.
And finally, Stefan, what would you say differentiates your study from past research?
Well, a bit of what I noted on before was that the study, while there is a large amount of literature in the sector and environmental governance generally, there hasn't been a kind of broad sweeping overview of the sector, which has such a large data set about the focus. So I think what's novel about ours is that we collected original data on the mission statements themselves, and we used that as an inductive basis to look at discourse, instead of looking at specific studies or within regions. We also added the financial and human resource capacity to that, and we coupled that with a regional analysis, so we could see how that differs across different world regions. And I think what we saw is that, one, that there is a unique focus within the sector on environmental management issues in general. Second, that there are specific NGOs which go across the different discourses, and that we can see that perhaps the focus of the sector is expanding. And the environmental organization sector, the environmental NGO sector, it's really broadening its focus. So maybe it's better understood as a sustainability NGO sector instead of just focusing on environmental issues, because we can see issues like livelihoods and rights and businesses and policies coming in, which specific organizations are focusing on it. And it's really encompassing broader sustainability issues.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Stefan, for your time. And thank you very much for joining us at the latest research news.
Thank you for having me.